father-in-law looked at the quilt my daughter made for his retirement party and said out loud in front of everyone at the table, "Well, that's a very amateur gift." Zoe was 7 years old. She had spent 11 weeks making that quilt. I know it was 11 weeks because I watched every single night. After dinner, after bath time, after I tucked her brother in, Zoe would sit at the kitchen table with her little sewing kit, the one her art teacher Miss Hensley had helped her pick out, and she would work. She didn't talk much while she sewed. She'd just hum quietly and move her hands, slow and careful, like she was doing something sacred. The squares were uneven. Some of the stitching puckered. One corner had a knot she couldn't figure out how to hide, so she just sewed a small fabric star over it. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. She'd chosen the colors because they matched the fishing cabin my father-in-law had told her about exactly one time. He'd mentioned it in passing at Christmas dinner 2 years earlier, that someday he wanted a cabin by a lake, blues and greens, somewhere quiet to retire to. Zoe had remembered. She was 7 and she'd remembered, and she'd pulled out every blue and green fabric square she could find at the craft store and laid them out on our living room floor for 3 days before she was satisfied with the arrangement. When she handed him the box at the party, she was beaming. She'd wrapped it herself too, with brown paper and twine, because she'd seen something like that on a YouTube video and thought it looked fancy. My husband was recording on his phone. My mother-in-law had her hand over her heart. He opened it, held it up, looked at it for maybe 4 seconds, and said what he said. "Well, that's a very amateur gift." Then he folded it back up, put it in the box, and set the box on the floor next to his chair. Not on the table, on the floor. Like it was trash he'd deal with later. He picked up his fork and went back to his steak. I looked at Zoe. The smile was still on her face, but it was frozen there, confused, the way a child's face looks when something happens that doesn't match any script she knows yet. She looked at me. I kept my expression as neutral as I could. I reached under the table and found her hand and squeezed once. My husband, Derek, that's what I'll call him, said nothing. Not a word. He kept his eyes on his plate, and I watched him do it, and something shifted in me that night, quietly, like a door swinging shut on its hinges. I didn't cry at the party. I didn't say anything. I picked up the box when we were leaving, put it in the trunk myself, and drove home with the radio off. Zoe fell asleep in the back seat. She never asked about it again. Not once. And that silence was somehow worse than if she had. The quilt went on her bed that night. It has been on her bed every night since. I want to explain something before I go further. My father-in-law, I'll call him my husband's father, because that's all he's ever really been to me, is the kind of man who has opinions about everything and apologies for nothing. He built a small commercial real estate business from scratch in the 90s, made good money, and somewhere along the way decided that financial success was the only meaningful metric for anything. Art was decoration. Hobbies were fine for children until they became distractions. Handmade things were what people gave when they couldn't afford real gifts. He had a Tiffany lamp in his living room. He had 2 original oils from a local gallery on his walls. He had a subscription to an architecture magazine he kept fanned out on his coffee table. He cared deeply about aesthetics, just not about where they came from, unless the price tag confirmed their value. He tolerated Zoe the way some men tolerate the weather, acknowledging it exists, occasionally commenting on it, never particularly interested in engaging. She was quiet, he said once, as if that were a flaw. She spent too much time drawing and sewing and doing craft stuff, as he called it. He asked Derek more than once whether Zoe was getting enough real activities, sports, math clubs, things that would matter later. What he didn't know, what I don't think he ever tried to find out, was that Zoe had been in occupational therapy since she was 4. Her fine motor delays meant that what came easily to most kids, writing, cutting, basic coordination, was a genuine daily challenge for her. The sewing hadn't just been a hobby. It had been her therapy homework made into something beautiful. Miss Hensley had suggested it after watching Zoe struggle with scissors in art class, and it had changed everything. The patience, the repetition, the pride in something she made with her own hands. It had given her a confidence she didn't have before. When his father called it amateur, he wasn't just dismissing a gift. He was dismissing 2 years of her fighting to do something her hands didn't want to do. He just didn't know that, and he never asked. After that party, I stopped pushing for family dinners. Derek and I never had a direct fight about it. We had the slow, careful kind of fight that happens when two people disagree about something important enough to avoid saying out loud. He thought I was being sensitive. I thought he was protecting the wrong person. We found a middle ground that was really just two people going in opposite directions at the same pace. We saw his parents at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that was mostly it. His father would ask Zoe polite, surface questions, and she would answer in her soft, careful way, and he would nod and turn back to whatever adult conversation was happening. She never offered him anything again. Not a drawing, not a card she made, nothing, I noticed. I don't think he did. Zoe turned 12. She was in 6th grade and had been in a community art program for 2 years. One of those nonprofit after-school things run out of a renovated storefront downtown called Cornerstone Arts. Her teacher there was a woman named Miss Dorbrent Aldridge, who had a loud laugh and paint permanently under her fingernails, and who called every kid my friend when she greeted them at the door. Zoe loved her completely. That year, Miss Aldridge started teaching the kids textile art, not just quilting, weaving, embroidery, mixed media fabric work. Zoe went absolutely still the first time she saw the loom. She told me later it felt like seeing something she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking. She started staying late 3 days a week. She started sketching designs in a notebook she kept on her nightstand. She started, quietly and without making any announcements about it, becoming very good. The spring showcase at Cornerstone was open to the public. It was a small event. Families, some local patrons, a few people from the City Arts Council. Miss Aldridge asked Zoe if she wanted to show the piece she'd been working on for 4 months. It was a large textile panel, maybe 3 feet by 4, combining quilting with embroidery and some woven sections. The colors were those same blues and greens she'd used when she was 7, but grown up now, more intentional, more complex. She'd worked the stitching into a pattern that, if you looked at it long enough, resolved into something like a lake at dusk, rippling. She said yes. We printed a small card for it with her name and the title she'd chosen, what I remembered. I didn't explain the title to anyone. I didn't have to. The event was on a Thursday evening. There were maybe 60 people in the room. I stood near the back with Zoe's little brother on my hip and watched people move through the space, stopping at her piece longer than most. A man in a gray blazer stood in front of it for almost 5 minutes. I didn't know who he was. I saw him speak to Miss Aldridge. I saw Miss Aldridge look across the room at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His name was Professor Whitmore. He chaired the Textile Arts Department at the State University, and he had come to the Cornerstone Showcase because he sat on the advisory board and always made a point of attending. He had been collecting student work for 20 years. Not buying it, usually, just documenting it, writing about emerging young artists in a regional newsletter he contributed to. But he told Miss Aldridge that night that he wanted to talk to Zoe's family. We spoke for about 20 minutes near the refreshments table. He asked Zoe questions about her process, and she answered with a specificity that surprised even me. She talked about the thread count she'd chosen, why she'd used a running stitch in one section and a satin stitch in another, what she'd been thinking about when she picked the final color for the border. He listened the way adults almost never listen to 12-year-olds, like what she was saying mattered, and he didn't want to miss any of it. Before he left, he told us he'd like to feature what I remembered in a regional exhibition he was curating in the fall, a show of emerging artists under 18 from across the state. It would be at the University Gallery. There would be a small catalog. He asked if we'd consider it. I looked at Zoe. She nodded so fast I almost laughed. The exhibition opened in October. Zoe's piece had a full page in the catalog. Professor Whitmore wrote 4 sentences about it, and one of them described her work as demonstrating a technical maturity and emotional coherence rare in artists of any age. I read that sentence approximately 40 times in the car on the way home. Three things happened after that. The first was that a woman who had attended the exhibition, she ran a small boutique textile gallery in the city, reached out to Ms. Aldridge asking if Zoe would be willing to show work in a group exhibition she was planning for the following spring. We said yes. The second was that Zoe started getting invited to use arts workshops and juried shows. One of her pieces won a regional award for student textile artists. The award came with a modest scholarship for future arts education, $4,000, which I put directly into an account I opened in her name. The third thing was the offer. A collector, someone connected to the university gallery, someone whose name I will not use here, came to the boutique show in April. He spent a long time in front of what I remembered, which Zoe had chosen to show again. He asked the gallery owner about it. He made an offer. I want to be clear about what happened next because people get this wrong. The collector did not buy the quilt. He purchased a limited edition fine art print of what I remembered, a high-resolution archival reproduction that Professor Whitmore had helped facilitate as part of the university's Emerging Artists Documentation Project. The original piece came home with us. It is still on Zoe's wall. She has never considered selling it. But the print sold. The collector paid $8,000 for a signed, framed archival print. Professor Whitmore's program kept a percentage for the documentation project. Zoe received the remainder. She was 13 years old. I don't lead with the money when I tell this story, because the money was never the point. But I'm telling you the number because of what happened next. My husband's father called on a Sunday afternoon in May. I was in the kitchen. Derek was outside with the kids. His father's voice on the phone was different from the usual. There was a warmth in it, a familiar bonhomie that I recognized as the register he used when he wanted something. He had heard about the sale. He wasn't sure exactly how. Derek's mother, probably, or someone they knew who'd seen the gallery announcement. He offered congratulations. He said he always knew Zoe had a special talent. He said it with such ease, as if that were a sentence he'd said before, as if it had some history. Then he said it. You know, technically speaking, I think I have some claim here. That quilt, the original inspiration for the piece, she made that for me. It was a gift. I was the subject in a sense. That gives me some standing, doesn't it? I sat down at the kitchen table. I want to tell you I said something brilliant right then. I didn't. I said I need to call you back, and I hung up. I sat there for probably 10 minutes. I thought about the retirement party. I thought about the box on the floor next to his chair. I thought about Zoe's face, that frozen smile. I thought about 11 weeks of evenings at the kitchen table, and one corner with a fabric star sewn over a knot she couldn't hide. Then I called Professor Whitmore. I wasn't sure why exactly. I think I needed someone outside the situation to hear it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'd like to write a letter, if you'll permit me. Not a legal document, just a letter. Something that states clearly what the work is, what it represents, and who created it." The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first described the piece and its context. The second detailed the documentation process, the exhibition history, the scholarly record that established Zoe as the sole creator with full artistic rights. The third paragraph was the one I read out loud to my husband that evening after the kids were in bed. It said, "The work titled What I Remembered was conceived, designed, and executed entirely by Zoe over a period of 4 months when she was 12 years old. The piece draws on a childhood experience of making a gift that was not received in the spirit in which it was offered. The title is her own. The meaning is her own. The rights are her own. Any claim to the contrary would be, to put it plainly, without foundation and without dignity." Derek read it twice. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I'll handle it." I don't know exactly what he said to his father. He took the call in the backyard, and I watched through the kitchen window without being able to hear anything. The conversation lasted maybe 12 minutes. When he came back inside, he looked tired in the particular way that means someone has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. "It's handled," he said. "Are you okay?" I asked. He thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. I think I've been not okay about this for longer than the last 20 minutes. We didn't talk about it more that night. But something was different after that. The way the air is different after a storm. Same temperature, same house, but cleaner somehow. His father did not call again for 3 months. When he did, it was to ask if we were coming to his birthday dinner. He did not mention the letter, the print, the gallery, or the quilt. He spoke to Zoe on the phone briefly and told her he heard she'd been doing well with her art. Zoe said, "Thank you." She was polite. She was warm. She didn't offer anything more, and she didn't need to. What she didn't know yet, what I told her later, when she was old enough for the full story, was what she had done at 7 years old. Sitting at that kitchen table every night, humming quietly, hands moving slow and careful over fabric she'd chosen because one man had mentioned a lake in passing, and she'd held on to it. She hadn't been making a quilt. She had been paying attention in the way that some people never learn to do, in the way that turns out, over time, to be the only thing that really matters. When I told her everything, the party, the box on the floor, the phone call, the letter, she was quiet for a long time. Then she got up and looked at the quilt on our wall. The colors had softened a little over the years, the way fabric does. The star she'd sewn over the knot in the corner had always been her favorite part. "I'm glad you kept it," she said. "I was never going to get rid of it," I told her. She nodded like that was the answer she already knew, like she'd known it for years, and she went back to her sketchbook and kept drawing. I still think about that retirement party sometimes. Not with anger anymore, that part burned off a long time ago. I think about it the way you think about a moment that turned out to matter more than you knew it would at the time. He put the box on the floor. That's the part I can't forget. Not even to the side, not set aside gently, on the floor next to his chair like something to be dealt with later. And Zoe stood there with that frozen smile, and I held her hand under the table, and I made myself stay very still. I didn't make a scene. I didn't say what I was thinking. I just decided, quietly and completely, that I was going to protect what she'd made. That decision, to pick up the box and walk out and put the quilt on her bed that night, that was the first thing. The rest of it came from her. What I've come to understand, watching Zoe grow from that 7-year-old at the kitchen table into the young artist she is now, is that character isn't something you teach in a single conversation. It builds in the small, repeated moments that nobody is filming. It built in her every night she sat down at that table and worked through the frustration of hands that didn't cooperate yet. It built in the way she chose her colors because she'd actually listened to someone, really listened, the way most adults don't, and then went and did something with what she'd heard. That kind of integrity, that basic decency of paying attention to another person and honoring it with effort, that's not something you can buy or perform. Either you have it or you're still working on getting it. And then there's the intelligence she brought to it. Not the kind that shows up on tests, but the kind that looks at a loom for the first time and goes very still because it recognizes something. The kind that knows, at 12 years old, to call a piece what I remembered and not explain it to anyone. She understood that the work could speak if she let it, and she had the wisdom to get out of its way. But the part that moves me most, when I think about it honestly, is the persistence, the occupational therapy. The years of hands that didn't do what she asked them to. The choice, over and over again, to sit back down and try again anyway. Nobody gives you a medal for that. Nobody sees the 100 nights before the piece that wins the award. They see the award. They don't see what it cost. His father saw an $8,000 print and thought he deserved a share of it because it had once inconveniently passed through his hands. He'd spent 6 years not asking how Zoe was doing, and then called on a Sunday afternoon with the warmth of a man who thought none of that mattered now that there was money on the table. The distance between who he was and who Zoe was had never been clearer than in that moment. What happens to people like that isn't punishment exactly. It's just the natural result of who they chose to be. He dismissed a 7-year-old's gift and lost 6 years of knowing her. That's the whole story. Whatever he thought he was protecting by sneering at that box, his taste, his standards, some idea of what mattered, It cost him more than he'll probably ever fully reckon with. Zoe doesn't carry bitterness about it. I've watched for it, and it isn't there. What she carries instead is the quilt, still on her wall, the stars she stitched over the knot she couldn't hide. She knows what she made, and why she made it, and what it took to make it. That knowledge belongs to her in a way that no one can walk into a room and take away. I think that's what I want her to hold on to longer than anything else, that the work you do with integrity, the attention you bring to it, the willingness to keep going when it's hard, those things compound quietly over time. And eventually they speak in rooms where the people who dismissed you are standing there wishing they paid closer attention. She figured that out at 7. I'm still catching up.